Welcome, everybody. For those who are filtering in, we are going to be talking about soils tonight with Naim Edwards from MSU Extension. I'd like at some point, Naim maybe could talk about what's going on at the spot over on the west side of Detroit. There's lots of cool stuff over there. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that at some point. But if you don't know me, my name is Keto. I coordinate the education series for Keep Growing Detroit along with Tepfira. Really excited to be with you guys tonight. It's been a crazy day. We put some new plastic on over at one of our greenhouses, got the plastic blown off last week. And so we had a stellar group of volunteers come through and help us replace that, which was quite an effort, but the weather held out for us and it came all together, which we're very excited about. So that's good. So I guess with that, I'll hand the mic over to Naim and we'll take it from there. Oh, well, I guess one last thing. If you I just want to say that if you have questions along the way, please drop those in the chat, and I will kind of navigate those and make when Naim, there's a kind of natural breaking point, I'll make sure that Naim knows what the questions are. So Naim, you don't have to worry about watching the chat necessarily. I'll keep an eye on it for you so you can just focus on what you're doing. And then if there's time at the end, hopefully there will be, we can open it up so people can come off mute and we can have, make it more conversational. If you have specific questions about this or that. Sound good? Okay. Take it away.
Sweet. Thank you, Keto. Good evening, everybody. My name is Naim Edwards, and I do work for Michigan State University Extension. My primary role within Extension is developing an urban agriculture research center right here in Detroit. It's close to Losser and 6 Mile or 6 Mile Grand River area in the neighborhood of Riverdale. It's about a 3.5 acre site. I'd be happy to show our promo video, which was made last September at the end of the presentation for folks who may want to stick around if we have more time for it, or I'll simply post a link to it in the chat at the end of the conversation. And I'm sure Keto could share it out as well. Today, I will be talking to you guys about ways to improve your soil for crop quality and yield. And with that, I will jump into the slideshow, sort of. Let's see. So, greetings, gratitude, grounding. It's always good to, well, especially when you're talking about soil, get grounded. I am grateful to Keep Growing Detroit for inviting me to speak to you guys. I'm grateful to the folks on the call for taking time out of their lives to learn and hopefully enrich your minds and figure out and continue to learn ways to invest in yourself and your community and the health of the earth. I'm grateful to be a person who has had the blessing, the privilege, the opportunity to learn about soil, and to also be someone who tries to invest in myself and in my planet and community as well. So grounding, if you just pretend, I see some folks are in the garden already, got your feet on the ground, feet in the soil, minds ready and open to learn. Feel free to take some deep breaths and just focus and be as present as you would like to be. And now with that, I'll hop into a soil specific presentation. Soil basics. On the right is like a bonsai tree growing in a little pot. And essentially, you can get a ton of plant matter with a very small amount of soil, because the majority of plant mass actually comes from that wonderful air or molecule that we exhale called carbon dioxide. But the elements, the nutrients that are in the soil are the thing that makes plant growth possible. So although the majority of the plant is water, carbon dioxide, sugar, those things could not be produced and synthesized in a way without plants' ability to get critical nutrients from the soil. So soil is the foundation of terrestrial life. There would be no life living, walking, crawling, flying on the planet Earth without soil. And that is primarily because it's the foundation of vegetation, which is the first food in a lot of ways for all living things. You either eat from a plant, or if you're a plant, you depend on soil, sunlight, and water to grow. Soil itself is made up of nutrients and minerals. Another way of thinking about that is just atoms, molecules, solid material, if you will. And it is built by organisms, and I put forces of nature. So a lot of us are familiar with compost. You need living things in the soil that are actively digging, churning, digesting, leaving droppings or waste byproducts of their growth. And then there are things like freezing temperatures, ice, water, wind, simply rocks striking each other, things like that, that cause larger particles, stones, etc., to break down and form the smaller particles in soil. So we can manage soil. The main reason we're on this call today, or this webinar, we can manage soils to enhance nutritional value and the yield of the food that we eat. A growing, I guess, popular use in agriculture, particularly at the larger scale, is the ability to profit and utilize farm management and soil to sequester carbon dioxide in the ground, which is super relevant. We just had tons of rain. Presumably all of us are familiar with climate change, and climate change being primarily caused by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Soil is a really great and effective medium for getting carbon out of the air and back into the ground and into the earth, and hopefully stabilizing our climate. And not lastly, but another thing that I wanted to highlight is soil can also be used to support biodiversity. So I mentioned that soil was the foundation of life on Earth, terrestrial life. Healthy soils lead to healthy fungi, healthy plants, healthy insects, healthy mammals, healthy animals, healthy humans. All of our health is dependent on being able to grow things in healthy soil. So with that, I wanted to jump into urban soil, and Keep Growing Detroit is a Detroit-based organization. The site that I'm developing is also in Detroit. I presume the majority of folks on the call are from Detroit. Got a fire truck passing by outside. Hopefully everyone's okay. I'll give them a second. So in the photo, and this is kind of a joke to some degree, but it's also a serious matter. In the photo, you can see a picture of things that we dug up at the Michigan State site as we were preparing the soil for cultivating plants. And in that picture are some river stones, which you would hope to find in the ground in a lot of places, but also bits and pieces of asphalt, glass, rebar, wire, pipes, fabric, tile, rubber, some PVC in there. And I'm sure most of us, if you've dug into the ground wherever you garden, have encountered similar materials in the soil that you manage. So I also want to speak to kind of urban soils throughout this presentation, with the understanding that the soils that we deal with, especially when we plant in the ground, are unique and different from what you might encounter in a more suburban or rural or natural area, if you will. So bullet point number one, urban soils are sometimes characterized as disturbed. If it's in an urban place, humans have probably built something there. Maybe something was demolished there. There could be a lot of foot traffic, vehicle traffic, people littering, stuff falling out of the air, humans are around it and disturbing it regularly. It can be compacted, so there's a higher likelihood that some heavy machinery at some point was on soil somewhere in Detroit, which forced all those particles that make that soil up together, often making it very hard. And soil can be, although not all urban soil is, contaminated, and that contamination can consist of simply trash and garbage and things that people throw out, metals and materials from buildings that may have been on the site in the past. Of course, if there was dumping in an area, people may have been bringing waste or refuse from somewhere else and dumping it somewhere. And then if it's petrochemicals, maybe from a gas leak, a septic tank, underground oil storage. There's a lot of chemicals and lead paint, lead pipes and things like that also leach out into the soils that we deal with. And it's good to be mindful of all these things as we cultivate and care for soil to produce healthy plants. And I put it, and not always though. So there are parts of the city and parts of every city where the soil is pretty pristine, pretty easy to work with. But it's not always the case. We often find a lot of stuff in there. So getting to like soil basics, soil has physical qualities, chemical qualities, and biological qualities. So the physical is kind of what the soil is just made up of at a non-molecular level. And usually there's a diagram I'm showing on this screen that has that's like the soil texture diagram, if you will, or it's kind of a spectrum of soil particles. And you have clay, sand, and silt. And pretty much soils are classified fundamentally based on the quantity of clay, sand, or silt that you find in the soil. Clay is pretty much something we're all familiar with, especially if you do pottery or you simply have been outside on a wet day and had your shoes get stuck in the ground or heard that mucky sound. It's a very small particle, very sticky when it's wet, very hard when it's dry. Sand, most of us are familiar, hopefully, with beaches, sandboxes, and maybe you put sand down in the winter for better friction and traction on the sidewalk. And then silt, I would say I usually encounter silt probably the most if you're ever like on a lakeside or riverside and there's like a small particle that isn't quite sand, but definitely isn't clay. And silt is essentially a particle in between those two. So this diagram is simply showing, based on the percentage of clay, silt, and sand in your soils, there are classifications that your soil would be categorized as. And usually you want to go for somewhere in the middle, if you can see my cursor, for a clay loam, sandy loam, or loam. And that's essentially a structure that is optimal for plant roots to be able to grow through. And we'll get into the other reasons why you want to move away from being too sandy, too clayey, or the rare occasion when it's too silty. So the other physical characteristic I wanted to lift up is soil is also made up of air and water. So there are lots of little pockets in soil, hopefully, that have air and water. And those pores not only allow oxygen and water to move through the soil, but other living things as well. Nematodes, roots, worms, ants, anything that lives in the soil needs those spaces to be able to move through the soil because they can't move directly through a particle in the soil. So chemical, pH, which is hydrogen potential, or essentially how acidic or how alkaline your soil is. Contaminants, I mentioned earlier, it could be lead, it could be a petrochemical, some type of chemical contamination could be in the soil. And then nutrients, we're all familiar with our vitamins as well as essential elements, iron, manganese, potassium, phosphorus, things like that. And we'll be talking about those things later in the presentation. And then last but not least is the biological component of soil. Humus, which many of us are familiar with, is the decaying matter in the soil, which is the dying component of soil, things that have lived their lives and are rotting essentially. And then there are the living parts of soil, which consist of anything that's alive in the soil. And I simply put roots, fungi, worms, bacteria, insects, seeds, etc. So I think I wanted to, oh, okay, I'll keep it moving. So porosity, getting back to the space, the air pockets and the water pockets in soil, porosity, structure, and texture are ways that we can continue to form a vocabulary around describing soil. If you're talking to a soil expert or if you're submitting soil samples, this is language that you might get back in response to submitting a soil sample. So you want to know what your soil texture is, how the soil is structured, and the porosity of the soil. So once again, the texture is what I mentioned earlier, how much sand, how much silt, how much clay. The structure is how the sand, silt, and clay, as well as the organic matter, stick together in the soil. So is it really clumpy? Is it kind of porous? And the diagram on the right has common terms used with soil structure. So granular, it crumbles really easy. Blocky, you can have really clumpy soil. Single grain, I think of like fine, like salt or something like that. Massive is when you dig up or put a shovel into the soil and you get like huge clumps and they're very hard to break apart. And then platy is kind of like a flaky, you think of if you smashed a plate on the ground and you took all those little pieces and put them together, a structure similar to that. And then porosity, once again, is just the spaces between particles, which matters as it pertains to having the right amount of air and water available in the soil. So here's another photo. If you imagine these dark, larger circles, which represent sand particles. Sand is the largest of the three particles of clay, sand, and silt. Silt is smaller than sand and bigger than clay, but closer to the size of clay. And then there's organic matter. So you can think of this diagram as like a really close microscopic photo of what soil should look like. And in any clump of soil, you presumably would find bits of sand, bits of clay, bits of silt, and then organic matter. And then all the white space in there are the areas where gases and water would be moving through the soil, as well as organisms. Okay. Woo! I hope everyone's still with me. Sometimes I remember when I first started learning about soil, I was like, soil's so dumb. And then I slowly started to appreciate how all of the things that we should know about soil are important in understanding both soil's value and ways to manage soil and ways that support ourselves, support the plants that we grow and care about. So I have a few more terms to get to, and then I'll get into more, hopefully, applied information. So for the chemical, pH, once again, is hydrogen potential, which in a nutshell is the amount of hydrogen atoms or positive charges available in soil. And that ranges from 0 to 14. Numbers below 7 if you get a soil pH result, and we'll talk about soil tests later in this presentation, are more acidic. And then alkaline or basicity of soil is a pH higher than 7. And nutrient availability, sometimes you can have soil that has a ton of nutrients in it, but the nutrients won't necessarily be in a form that plant roots can absorb. So you could have one essential element is iron. You can have a ton of iron in your soil and the iron not be in a form that plant roots can actually utilize. So one of the issues that might limit a plant's ability to absorb iron is the pH. And therefore, if your pH is too high or too low, you want to learn ways to move it in the direction, presumably towards neutral and a 6.5 to 7.5 range. So the diagram that I'm showing on this slide, across the bottom, there's a pH of 3.5, highly acidic, 5.3, relatively acidic, and then 7, which is neutral. And then it's showing essentially a soil particle. You can imagine a piece of sand, a piece of silt, or a piece of clay. And then based on how acidic it is, and the most acidic 3.5, there's more plus signs, which means that it can attract more positive or negative, the particle itself is attracting positive and negative charges, which all of the elements that we'll talk about in this diagram, it's sulfate, hydrogen, aluminum, and chlorine. And as you increase the pH, you actually change what particles can be held, what elements can be held in the soil based on the pH of the soil particles. So it's optimal. The majority of nutrients that plants need are most available when the pH is 7, or between 6.5 and 7.5. So that's the pH that we want to aim for. And once you optimize your pH, you can start to optimize your plant's ability to absorb the nutrients that it needs. So following in that thread, this is a diagram, and there's lots of photos that you can look at that are plant specific. You could probably Google them. For example, nutrient deficiency in tomato, nutrient deficiency in collard green, cabbage, etc. And based on what the leaves look like, you can actually be informed on what may be missing in the soil. So this diagram is showing that for young leaves and also for older, more mature leaves, based on their appearance, how can that tell you what is present or lacking in the soil? So this says potassium has yellowing. If there's too much potassium, yellowing at the tip. Oh, if it's deficient in potassium, you'll see yellowing at the tips and edges of leaves on a plant. Dead or yellow patches develop on leaves. If there's a manganese deficiency, manganese is really important for plant defenses. You'll see yellow spots or elongated holes between veins on plants. So I don't need to read through everything on this diagram, and there's a website both at the bottom of this slide, and the slides will be shared out after the presentation as well. By understanding how nutrients are in our soil and how many nutrients are in our soil, we can once again figure out how to grow plants the way we want to grow them. So last but not least, we covered the physical, the chemical, and now the biological. There's a soil food web, which I will go over quickly and then show a short video on. The soil food web, similar to a food chain, which is a common term that folks use, simply shows all of the life, the diversity that lives in soil and the value of it. So there are larger things like groundhogs, less desirable things in our gardens like voles, moles, potentially rats and things that live in the soil that we wouldn't want there. But all those things play a role in either adding nutrients, adding organic matter, or removing them from the soil. And they also play a role in our plant's ability to meet its needs to be healthy. So this diagram is showing organic matter, kind of first level, microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, nematodes. And this is essentially, the takeaway from this is to just be mindful that soil, living soil, is full of life, things we can see, things we can't see, and all of those living things are going to play a role in our ability to have productive plants. So I will stop this presentation and share my screen again with a video I want to show on the soil food web. So this video is by the Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School. They have an entire website all about organic, sustainable ways of managing soil. So I strongly encourage you guys, if you have the time, to YouTube or Google Dr. Elaine Ingham. And I'm pretty sure her name will come up in the video. Nutrient balance, sequestering carbon in soil, the value of the soil food web, ways to add nutrients and manage soil to support plants. So without further ado, here is the video.
What is the soil food web? To understand the soil food web, let's start with the term food web. We all know about the food chain, the animal kingdom on top of which are us humans, right? Well, if we look a little closer, we can see that some members of the food chain don't just eat one thing. That goes for humans too. So the reality is more like a web than a chain. This is the food web. There happens to be a food web in the soil too. This is the living part of the soil made up of insects, earthworms, and much smaller microscopic creatures such as fungi and bacteria. Dr. Elaine Ingham has pioneered research into the microorganisms in the soil over the last 4 decades and has worked with a team of research scientists to understand how they interact with each other and with plants. The soil food web can be thought of as the soil biome. Just as humans have a gut biome responsible for digesting our foods, so too the soil has a biome, which breaks down organic matter and releases nutrients in plant-available form. This is how nature has been feeding plants for billions of years. The major groups that make up the soil food web are bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes. When in balance, these different groups interact with each other and with plants to create abundant ecosystems such as the great forests of the world. Have you ever wondered how forests can be the most productive ecosystems in the world without the need for any fertilizers or pesticides? The answer lies in soil biology. With a healthy biome, the soil can provide plants with all the nutrients they need, and with a number of other benefits, such as protection from pests and diseases, protection from drought and from flooding. The soil food web is, essentially, nature's operating system. Unfortunately, we humans have disturbed the soil food web in almost all of the soils that we manage, causing it to become unbalanced. As a result, the plants we grow struggle. Plowing is the major cause of the problem, as it destroys the larger microorganisms, such as fungi and protozoa, leaving the soil food web out of balance. This results in a system breakdown. Nutrients are no longer made available to plants, and protection from diseases is compromised. Before the Industrial Revolution, humans would plow using oxen or a bull, which provided around 3 or 4 horsepower. Modern tractors can yield 400 horsepower or more. So far more damage is done to the soil biome by modern machinery. The use of chemicals has compounded the problem. The good news is that we can restore the soil food web to most soils within just a few months. This results in a number of benefits, both for farmers and for the environment. With a balanced soil food web in place, farmers need not use fertilizers at all. They don't need to use pesticides either, as nature's operating system protects plants from attack. Herbicides, used to kill weeds, are not required either, as weeds only thrive in conditions where the food web is out of balance. Restoring the soil food web means farmers save money on chemical inputs across the board. It also means that their yields increase dramatically. In some cases, farmers working with Dr. Elaine Ingham have seen yields increase by over 200%. This is because the soil food web provides plants access to a constant flow of nutrients from soil organic matter and from the soil particles themselves. That's right, sand particles contain nutrients, and guess what? Fungi and bacteria can harvest those nutrients. They then make these available to the plant in a process that the plant actually controls. This means that plants get access to the type of nutrients they need precisely when they need them. That's how you maximize yields and optimize profits. For the environment, there is a whole host of benefits of having a balanced soil food web. Humanity is facing a number of existential threats. Let's take a look at how some of these are related to the soil. The most obvious one is soil erosion. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has estimated that we only have around 60 years left before all the world's topsoil is depleted. Other estimates are as low as 30 years. The soil food web prevents soil erosion by both wind and water by building structure. Please watch the animation on soil structure for more information. Another existential threat we are facing is ecosystem collapse. The UN has recently stated that insect populations have been decimated by around 25% each decade for the last 30 years. That means that there are 57% less insects today than there were in 1989. Bird populations have declined by 1/3 in the last 15 years in parts of Europe. So how does the soil food web help? Well, the UN has identified the use of pesticides as a major cause in the decline of insect populations. Please watch the animation on pests and diseases to find out how nature's operating system protects plants against attack, eliminating the need for pesticides. Another threat to life on Earth is climate change. Fortunately, the soil is capable of holding tremendous amounts of carbon in the bodies of microorganisms, and some mega-organisms too. The biggest living organism in the world is not a whale, it's a fungus found in Oregon that is the size of 1,665 football fields. It is between 2,000 and 8,000 years old, and it is made mostly of carbon. By restoring the soil food web, we could put a stop to climate change. Please watch the animation on soil carbon sequestration for more details. At the Soil Food Web School, we train people like you to help farmers transition away from using chemicals to farming in harmony with nature by restoring the soil food web. For more information about the numerous benefits of the soil food web and how you can get involved, visit soilfoodweb.com.
Sweet. So as I transition back to the slideshow, if folks could enter into the chat anything that stood out from the video, free to share. Get ready to jump back in.
Excuse me, could you please repeat that?
I was just asking if folks could share one thing that stood out in the video to them.
I was impressed with the fact that it only takes a few months to reverse the damage that had been done if we're able to allow the natural fungi, et cetera, in the soil. I thought that was pretty amazing, a few months versus years.
Yep, and I think COVID, in a lot of ways, right after the shutdown, showed how quickly a lot of natural systems can restore themselves. My computer is looking a little choppy. Can everyone hear me okay? And
yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you good.
Okay, cool. And I'll share my screen again. So yeah, I really wanted to show that video just to emphasize that humans have a tendency to think about treating soil and managing a lot of situations mechanically and by applying lots of things. But there's a ton of value and work being done by all the other living things that live in the soil without us having to do too much work.
So there was a few things mentioned in the chat. You see this sequestration? There's a question mark. Could you talk about that? Naim? Did I lose you?
Could you repeat what you said, Keto?
Yes. I was just commenting on the chat. So there's just a few notes just following up on your question.
Okay.
So sequestration, maybe if you wanted to elaborate on that a little bit, and then just also somebody said, Asha said, what's out for me is that weeds thrive in soil that is unbalanced. So Deza was basically saying,
okay, cool. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my Zoom is freezing up and I've got the little circle thing going around. I am going to log out and log back in as quickly as possible.
Okay.
Hang
cool.
on.
Yep. Anybody know any good jokes? Good question, Tish. Why did the farmer name his pig Ink? Why is it, Pat? Ha 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 ha. Nice. You know, yeah, I love these jokes. I have a 7-year-old, so I guess I'm just in that mindset.
I made it.
All right, you're back.
Yes. And I have a fun, one of my favorite soil jokes.
Okay.
How does soil get rich?
I don't know, Naim. How does soil get rich?
Nature makes it rain.
Nice.
All right. So regarding the sequestration question, essentially as all plants are growing, nature will naturally put carbon back into the soil as the plant's roots grow, and the plants are part of the soil food web. They will go back underground, and multiple folks have observed that tree roots are almost as large below ground as the trees are above ground. So that's one way. The other way is that plants will actually release carbon-based compounds through their roots into the soil, molecules that they produce in the leaves. They'll produce them based on pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and then release those nutrients into the soil as well. Tito, if you could give me or re-give me host abilities, I can share again.
And then there was also a question about topsoil disappearing.
Erosion.
How is topsoil going to disappear? It seems like it would just be redistributed.
Yeah, so disappear could be a misnomer. It's essentially disappearing from where it is and appearing someplace else. But usually when we clear soil, we expose it to air or wind and rain. And when it washes or blows away, that top layer, the topsoil, is essentially being pushed somewhere else. And usually in a way where wherever it settles, it's not settling in a place where it can be utilized. Oftentimes we're either washing it down rivers, drains, sewer systems, or it's being blown, into streets, buildings, and places where it's less capable of being utilized. But it isn't disappearing in a technical sense.
Okay.
Okay. The last thing I want to highlight before moving forward with the soil food web is once you understand that there are worms and ants and all kinds of creatures and critters that are not only turning soil, but producing compost and compostable materials, I really think about it as if I use a tractor or a rototiller or a shovel or a broad fork, I'm probably only doing that for a couple hours, maybe a couple times a year. But a worm or an ant or anything that lives in the soil is working on the soil every single day of its life. So from the time a worm, hatches from an egg, worms and ants are considered to be the two arthropods that do the most soil turning. And worm castings are, of course, a popular item. But, how much could 100 worms essentially do the work of one tractor in a growing season if you just let the worms do whatever they do in the soil in optimal conditions? And if those things are happening, then how much money and time and carbon footprint do you save by not having to use the tractor and simply let the worms live their best life? Okay. Without further ado, we will hop into managing soil. This is a wonderful photo that I found on recruitdetroit.com of KGD's, one of KGD's farm managers, Akello's legs and a broad fork at KGD. So structural preparation. Now that we understand what soil structure is, these are two photos essentially showing common ways that humans start to work the soil, both to kill the vegetation that's on the surface, as well as loosen it up and prepare soil for adding new plants or new seeds to it. On the right are some discs attached to the back of a tractor. On the left is MSU's summer intern, Lauren, operating our BCS with a rototiller, a precision depth tiller. And that's essentially two devices that are either churning or chopping into the soil, essentially to break up the particles and the structure that may inhibit plant growth. So usually when we're using machines or higher technological devices, we're causing a greater soil disturbance, which does have potential benefits. We're killing weeds, we're turning up nutrients and creating spaces for plants to grow, but we're also destroying a lot of the life that's already in the soil. And those processes also release a lot of carbon dioxide. And once again, in that third bullet point, it could be a necessary evil. If you're starting with absolutely awful soil and you really want to till it, if you till it the right way, that can create more opportunity for the soil to heal itself faster than simply trying to work it with hand tools or not at all and experiencing a lot of challenges with getting plants in a hard soil. And then the last bullet point is beware of the soil seed bank. So in addition to opening up new channels and loosening up the soil and creating new air and new kind of gritty, grainy seed to soil contact, you're also stirring up the soil seed bank. And I will simply ask if folks know what the soil seed bank is in the chat. Feel free to respond. And I will keep it moving. Or a simple yes or no. Never heard of the soil seed bank. Jill says the seed's already in the soil that you're now moving around. Absolutely. So unbeknownst to some of us, the soil is jam-packed with potentially trillions, if not a number bigger than trillions, zillions and gazillions of seeds that are just waiting for a human being to come clear all the plants off and give that seed an opportunity to live its best life. And oftentimes we'll start, like in this picture, with a really clear patch of land, and we're like, ooh, a clean slate. I'm gonna plant whatever I want, and it's gonna thrive and be awesome. And then like a week later, you're like, I didn't plant all those little seeds. What's all this stuff doing? And worst case scenario, you'll end up like this last photo. And we've all seen scenes like this across gardens. It essentially looks like an unmanaged lot, if you will, or an intentionally managed urban prairie, we'll call it for the sake of a kinder term. All those plants in this photo came from a seed that was already present in the ground, and simply by not mowing or by perhaps mowing and tilling, gave all those seeds the opportunity to grow and turn into adult plants by opening up the soil in a way that allowed them to grow. So when we are tilling and clearing land for soil preparation, it's just something to be mindful of. On that note, I am curious. I see that there are 21 people on the call. If you could share, if you grow plants in the ground in a raised bed and pots, just share how you're growing so I can be more familiar with the kind of pots, ground, and raised beds. Cool. And we'll also talk about different ways to grow, not just in the ground. So a lot of folks are doing multiple ways, integrated, diversified plant cultivation. I love it. Okay, so if you're not using super duper heavy tools, here are 3 other kind of hand tool alternatives to a rototiller or tractor implements. On the left is Molly operating a broad fork, similar to what we saw with Akello. In the middle is a young gentleman managing a hard rake, upside down to smooth and level the soil out. And when you allow the tines to touch the ground, you're presumably using the tines to break up larger clumps, granular or blocks of soil. And then on the far right are two kinds of cultivators. The bottom one kind of mimics a disc that you would attach to the back of a tractor. And the other one is kind of like ninja stars or some kind of finger-like material that when it's contacting the soil, it's essentially chopping it into little pieces. And these are ways to till soil and loosen soil without creating the same level of disturbance that you do with a rototiller, rotary plow, moldboard plow, things like that.
Before you go on, Naim, there was a question about the broad fork and how it works.
Okay. Oh, on that note, and I'm happy to explain super quick. KGD has an awesome, I think it's like an 8-minute YouTube video on how to use a broad fork. Essentially, as you see Molly standing here, you put your weight while the broad fork is upright on the top of it, pushing its tines into the ground. When it's as deep as it can go, you step off of it, and then you step behind it essentially, and then you pull it towards you. And the broad fork, if I can use my hands, if that's worth it, it gets down into the soil and then lifts up the soil in a way that creates new air pockets and allows water. And if you have compost or other things that you may have put on the soil surface to fall into the cracks that the broad fork makes when it lifts up the soil. And then you would simply, in succession, push it into the ground, lean it back, take a step back, push it into the ground, lean it back, take a step back, and then you'll create little furrows in your plant row where you can then use a hard rake to smooth that out. And it simply helps to loosen up soil at a deeper depth than you might without it and without having to use a shovel. So if you want the more detailed version of that, I would YouTube, and maybe Keto can put it in the chat, a link to the Keep Growing Detroit Broad Fork YouTube video.
Work on it.
Okay. So some folks are philosophically or ideologically opposed to tilling, especially with the understanding of the carbon footprint that tilling may have. Some folks might not be able to afford or have access to a rototiller or a tractor. And some folks simply might be lovers of all things that live in the soil and say, I don't want to do any harm to what's in the ground. I will simply build on top of the soil. And the two examples that come to mind for zero soil disturbance techniques for gardening are lasagna gardening, which is pictured here on the left, and raised beds, which a lot of us are familiar with. This is a photo from Cadillac Urban Farms, which is in Southwest Detroit, close to Junction and Michigan Ave. So lasagna gardening, essentially you're taking cardboard or a porous biodegradable material. It could be newspaper. You know, I think those are the two main ones, cardboard and newspaper. Lay that over grass, presumably, or over any kind of soil. Then on top of the cardboard or the paper, you would put straw or leaves. Then you would put fresh food waste, which most folks call greens or manure or manure. If you're using manure, this is kind of a food safety public thing. Be sure you know where the manure comes from. Make sure it's presumably manure from a horse, chicken, or an animal that is not a dog, cat, or something domesticated and living in a home with humans with a modified human diet. And then in addition to the manure, you're adding straw, leaves, food waste, again, and manure. And what that is essentially creating is an ideal texture. As all those things break down and decompose, they will attract the living things that are part of the soil food web and create a medium that plant roots can really thrive in. On the top, they put topsoil. So that's reintroducing, in addition to all of that organic matter, topsoil is going to contain those sand, silt, clay particles as well and help to mix those in. And then once you have all of that, presumably there would be no soil seed bank in that mixture. And as the materials decompose and mix together, you're really creating an optimal, nutrient-rich weed-free environment that is also full of moisture. So hopefully you don't have to water as much to grow your plants in. And that, I've seen lasagna gardens probably as thin as, I want to say 8 inches. And some people can really, depending on how many materials and how much stuff you have, you can make them a foot or 2 or more than that deep, and essentially make a raised bed out of lasagna gardening. And then you're also smothering everything beneath the cardboard, hopefully killing any weeds that would come through, disturb your, I see bunny poo. Bunny poo does count as a okay manure, but that's I would say for a whole nother presentation, learning safe manure management, incorporation techniques is super valuable to keep contamination and bacteria and parasite exposure out of your body and away from other people. Okay, so getting those nutrients into our plants. I'll pause and I'll ask, what are the main, if there are any, because this isn't something that a lot of people necessarily think about, what are the primary vitamins and nutrients you want to get out of your food when you grow a vegetable? If you know, what's your body like asking for when you bite an apple or eat a salad or fry some, well, maybe not fry, fry some greens or some green tomatoes. What is your body saying, oh, thank you so much for putting these things into me, besides a tasty particle?
Hydrates?
Vitamins. Sweet, yeah. So the same stuff they sell you in your one-a-days and your daily vitamins. And what do vitamins usually look like? This is another thing that I certainly didn't think too much about, but I learned about as a pre-med major. Vitamins, what do they look like? I won't torture you too much, but essentially on the right in this diagram is a photo of thymine, vitamin C, and vitamin A. And this is essentially a synopsis to show that almost all vitamins consist of 3 elements: hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. It's crazy. Every single vitamin we put in our body, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, simple as that. They're just structured differently. And then when they get into our bodies, they allow us to absorb different nutrients better, heal our bones, grow hair, have energy, expel waste, do all these amazing things that vitamins are supposed to allow us to do. But they're made of the air we breathe or exhale and inhale, water, and that's it. But the only way those things can be synthesized, once again, is from the nutrients. So when a plant grows, sunlight is hitting a leaf. This is called photosynthesis. Sunlight hits a leaf. Leaf has chlorophyll. It absorbs carbon dioxide, and it essentially takes water absorbed through the roots, mixes it with that carbon dioxide, and makes a ton of vitamins and sugar. And the only way it can do that is with other stuff, which includes iron, phosphorus, potassium, manganese, all that other stuff. But I just have to say that plants need the nutrients in the soil to be able to make everything else. Although the majority of what we're eating is simple, fundamental, like just stuff in the air and water. I think that's amazing. Everything that we eat comes from sunlight, air, and water, essentially. Oh, so the second bullet point, iron, calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all of those things are in the soil, and they can only get into the plants through the roots. There's like a couple of, I've heard cedar trees or something like that, that have bacteria on their leaves that can get nitrogen from fog or something, but that's a very rare case. All plants essentially are getting everything else besides hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide or carbon from the roots. And the roots live in the soil, unless you're doing hydroponic or aquaponic, which this is not about. So the plant root biome, or the rhizosphere, once again, just reiterating the same thing over and over. Plants are absorbing these nutrients through their roots. The plant roots, and this is also getting back to connecting the dots with carbon sequestration, is plant roots form relationships with the soil food web, bacteria and fungi, which make up a lot of carbon in the soil. And the roots are feeding those things, and those things, the bacteria and the fungi in particular, are also providing those nutrients in a form that can be absorbed by the roots for the plant. So there's a symbiotic relationship between plant roots and the life in the soil. So we want to optimize that life in the soil in order to get primarily nitrogen and other essential nutrients into the plant. So there's two groups that I wanted to highlight. Rhizobium are bacteria that can fix nitrogen in the soil. So we can be mindful of exploring ways to increase rhizobium. And there are some plants that require rhizobium. And I know that there's some plant catalogs that will send you a little packet. It looks kind of like a powder of rhizobium that you can put into your seed mix, your transplant mix, or your compost. And then when you spread it, you're actually adding these bacteria that fix nitrogen in the soil. So you don't have to add nitrogen. Can I go back to the previous slide for a moment? I can. I'll do it for 15 seconds. I'll just say pictured on the left is a photo of a plant, and above ground, it has like maybe 17 little needles. And below ground is like this extensive network of rhizobium, mycorrhizae, and then the root system of the plant itself, which is showing just how extensive. And when you pull a plant up, you see almost always, you never pull a clean plant and the roots are just bare. The roots are always bound and locked up with other parts of the soil. And sometimes when you look closely, you can actually see mycorrhizae or rhizobium. Okay, sweet. So rhizobium, once again, are the type of bacteria that can pull nitrogen out of the air and then turn it into nitrate, a form that plants can absorb it into the roots. The bacteria do that because the plant is making those vitamins and sugars in its leaves and then putting those things into the soil. So otherwise the bacteria wouldn't have access to sugar and vitamins without the plant. The plant wouldn't have access to nitrogen without the bacteria. Mycorrhizae, similarly, are the roots, if you will, or hair-like filaments of fungi and mushrooms that grow through the soil, and they have a very similar relationship with plants, but they provide more than just nitrogen. They can provide specific elements as well as proteins and enzymes that plants can absorb. And on the left photo are these little nodules on the roots, which is a picture of Rhizobia plant roots. If you ever pull them up and you see those nodules, those are little pockets where colonies of bacteria are taking nitrogen and turning it into nitrate, which the plant can absorb. And the only way that nitrogen gets into the soil is through pores in the soil, which is why you need good soil structure. On the right, the bottom right, is a photo of a plant grown in soil without mycorrhizae or beneficial fungi, and plants grown in soil with mycorrhizae or beneficial fungi. And you can see that the plants grown with mycorrhizae have a much more robust and healthy root system. So mycorrhizae are also something that you can purchase or cultivate in the soil. And one of the most important ways to support both rhizobium and mycorrhizae is to minimize how much you disturb the soil, either when you're tilling or when you're preparing your plant beds. Okay, so how am I supposed to know all this stuff about my soil? The simplest way is a soil test. And I simply listed kind of the three random, they're kind of random. Although I work for MSU, Keep Growing Detroit sends its soil samples to UMass, Amherst, and I also have sent soil tests to Cornell's New York State Soil Health Lab. Those are three entities. There are tens of hundreds of soil test labs around the country, but there's no need to necessarily send your soil to all kinds of places if KGD, as well as MSU, your local state land grant, have facilities that can give you baseline soil test. I know KGD uses UMass because they also test for lead. I use Cornell because Cornell has kind of a have it your way menu for your soil test. You can check different boxes and say, I want you to see how much sulfur or how much nitrogen or how much lead or how much arsenic or how much ammonium or molybdenum, all kinds. It's just a list of things that most soil tests don't necessarily always look for, that you can either ask to look for or ask them not to bother to check out. So essentially, to do a soil test, and I guess I could have shown some slides on that. You use a trowel, you remove that top layer of soil, usually where the roots are and the plants. You don't want any roots or plant mass in there. Depending on how much land you have, you would take multiple samples in kind of random spaces, evenly spaced apart. So I would say if you had a raised bed, for example, which was 4 by 8 feet, you would 5 shovels, just enough soil to cover the spade. You can mix that up in a 5-gallon bucket that was clean, and then just put 1 shovel or 1 cup full of that soil into a sandwich bag, and then send that to your soil test lab. If you have a huge site, there are soil bores and other ways to kind of consolidate and also make sure that if you're testing different areas, those areas themselves are similar in the history of that section, the soil structure of that section, etc. And I'm happy to talk about that more, and I apologize for not having any diagrams or photos on there, but there's a lot of resources out there to show how to appropriately do soil test. Soil tests also cost, I would say, anywhere from maybe $25 on the low end for a basic soil test, up to a couple hundred, depending on all the things you're asking the lab to look for in your soil. And usually, if you don't suspect that there's any contamination, you don't need to do super extensive tests. Most of the time in Detroit, we're simply worried about lead being the primary contaminant. If you're gardening on a place that may have had cars parked on it, or had a dry cleaner or some type of chemical facility, there would be an increased risk of having some other contaminants in there. So if you submit a sample to MSU, and I think most soil tests will kind of cover pretty much the same information, baseline information that you get back in a soil test include the pH, which I mentioned earlier, the amount of phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium in parts per million, the amount of calcium, the cation exchange capacity, which is the soil's ability to hold onto and release nutrients to plants when they need them. When the cation capacity is too low, that essentially means that nutrients are draining out of the soil really fast, especially when it rains, or if there's a lot of erosion, the soil's losing nutrients. It'll also tell you the percent of exchangeable bases. So between potassium, magnesium, and calcium, the ratio of how much of those bases are present in the soil. You can get a micronutrient analysis, boron, copper, manganese, zinc, and iron. It'll give you an organic matter percentage, which is usually between 1 and 5, I would say. And then nitrate and parts per million. And then some soil tests, this could be potentially additional costs or not, will actually give recommendations for ways to improve your soil based on what the results of the test were. So on the right, I'm just showing some bullets for what would be considered ideal or optimal conditions for what you would want to see on your test result. Usually if you have a pH between 6 and 7.5, you're in the optimum for your soil's ability to support plants and allow those plants to absorb nutrients. For phosphorus, between 30 and 60 parts per million. And the range is also related to the amount of organic matter and the soil texture that you have. So if it's sandier or more clay, you generally want, well, if it's more sandy, you want a higher number. And if it's clay, if it's on the lower end, that's okay. For potassium, between 150 and 250 parts per million. Magnesium, 50 to 70. For calcium, I didn't find an ideal number, but I put DP Fly, which stands for the MSU site that I manage. We have between 3,500 and 4,300, and that's considered, I suppose, safe. It's not like an excessive amount of calcium, and it's also not considered calcium deficient. For cation exchange capacity, generally between 20 and 30 MEQ per 100 grams. So that number over here would be 20 to 30. For organic matter, 3 to 5 is considered sufficient. 7 is optimal. Some plants grow really well in organic matter, and you can get that number even higher. I've seen 12% at the highest on a soil sample, and a lot of, especially kind of first year or early urban gardens, are in the maybe 2 to 4% range, depending on how that soil was managed before or the garden was started. And once again, MSU, and I know Cornell can include recommendations from soil experts in the results when they send them to you to help you interpret your soil test results. CEC is higher, better, or lower? I would say, once again, depending on the texture, if it's clay, it's okay if it's on the lower end. And if your soil is more sandy, it's okay if it's on the higher end. But just to go back, between 20 and 30 is optimal. If it's really low, usually the easiest short-term fix is to just keep adding organic matter, which kind of stabilizes the soil's ability to hold on to nutrients. Oh, so before I show all those wonderful things, I just want to ask, what kind of applications, practices do you guys use to improve soil nutrients, soil quality, soil vitamins? What kind of things are you putting into your raised beds, your plant pots, your in-ground stuff? Are you buying stuff? Are you making your own compost?
Hello.
Hey.
I'm making compost, and I actually bought micronizorol to add to each, to add to the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And that's worked out quite well.
Mycorrhizae, cool. Was this your first year purchasing them?
Yes.
Oh, sweet. I see someone put compost.
This is the first year I've gardened in the city of Detroit. I lived rural and I had dirt where I lived before, that I knew was safe and I could use.
Okay.
So
thanks for sharing.
I'm looking for all kinds of things to add. I built a bale garden.
Cool. Well, I'll be showing some more stuff. I see worm castings, blood meal, mycorrhizae, table scraps, purchased bags of compost, mulch, bunny poo. I like bunny poo. Bunny droppings, banana peel water. Peat moss. Peat moss is great for texture. Mulch and let the leaves decompose. Cool. So I'm always mindful of the fact that you guys are experts in your own rights, and a lot of the things that people mention in the chat are things that I may have missed, and and things that are valuable as well. So peat moss for sure. Decomposing leaves are really great. I dumped some shredded leaves on a plot that is super clayey at the MSU site last year. And that top layer is just super soft and moist. Usually you don't want to get too carried away with dumping leaves year after year because that can cause an imbalance, but it's definitely a good addition to incorporate into the soil. So I simply made a collage of some of the things that came to mind for me. And this is some of the stuff that you guys listed. Blood meal, which is animal blood that's dried out, usually in a powder form, really high in nitrogen, but also other nutrients, is a common nitrogen and improved soil texture. Fish fertilizer, I didn't see anyone mention that. And last year I was actually purchasing Detroit Central Christian, their water waste from their hydroponic operation, and pretty much just pouring that around the soil on the vegetable crops that we were growing. Worm castings, compost tea, mycorrhizae we heard again, and I'll kind of get into detail on some of these. Essentially, all of these are either adding an inorganic or an organic material to the soil that can improve soil health. So blood meal is more nutrients. They're not necessarily actively doing anything, but by adding them, you're allowing plant roots and the soil food web to perform better and be healthier. Fish fertilizer can have beneficial bacteria as well as nutrients in it, and also improve acidity. Worm castings is often chock full of beneficial bacteria as well as nitrogen, and similarly compost tea can also have a lot of beneficial bacteria as well as beneficial nutrients for plant growth. Mycorrhizae, once again, are the beneficial fungi. In the bottom right, shout out to Greg Willerer of Brother Nature Produce. He's a local person who can get compost to folks. If you are or are not yet a part of, on Facebook, a part of the Detroit Urban Farm webpage, Facebook page, you can get in touch with Greg through that. And that's also just a really great resource for anyone who's on the call who isn't a part of the Facebook page, Detroit Urban Farmers, a really great resource in addition to Keep Growing Detroit and the MSU site for getting questions answered about day-to-day garden management. Trifecta, which is sold by the Michigan Gardener out in the Thumb, is a fertilizer that I didn't use this year, but I used last year with pretty good results. And that in and of itself consists of a lot of these other things. The ingredients here are bone meal, green sand, potash, kelp meal, blood meal, poultry manure, urea, feather meal, cottonseed, rock gypsum, rock phosphate. So both a lot of nutrients as well as some of the more bacteria rich. So they're adding both inorganic and organic materials to the soil. Potash can be really useful for decreasing the alkalinity or increasing the acidity of the soil. So help it if you're above soil pH of 8, potash can help get that acidity down. Can also,
are you good?
Yep. Everyone could mute. That'd be great. Potash can also increase soil texture. So it's kind of like a salty material. And I've heard anecdotally people using things like sea salt or rock salt in small quantities in gardens and it being super effective. I don't necessarily recommend it. If you're interested in trying it, try it. But that's essentially also playing a role in balancing nutrients in the soil. Try at your own discretion. And then last but not least, in the bottom left is a triple blend exterminator, purchasing beneficial nematodes. So that's more so in a pest control realm adding things to the soil like nematodes, and I'm aware of like Arbico and some online sellers who can sell things like worms and actual organisms, the Rhizobium, the mycorrhizae, and actually directly applying those things to the soil are worth trying, especially if after a soil test or simply upon observation, you see that those things aren't really present in your soil. I'm curious, now that I'm looking at this, how much stuff can either be made on your own or sourced locally versus just going to buy stuff online. I would say one thing that a lot of folks recommend is if you have a pristine forest or natural wooded area and you go and get maybe a spoonful, a shovelful, a cupful of soil from that and mix it into your compost, that cupful from a forest or something may have the beneficial mycorrhizae in it, as well as other soil critters that may be deplete or underpopulated in our urban soil environments. And that can help kind of restore and boost those populations. Compost tea can definitely be homemade. Worm castings can definitely be homemade if you have red wigglers, or I presume there's probably people out there who have collected earthworms or concentrated earthworms and simply collected their worm castings. I'd be curious if folks have fish tanks or something, if you save the water from your fish tank and use that as a fertilizer. I wouldn't pour it directly on the vegetables, but if you could incorporate that into compost or soil, that would be interesting as well. And I will keep it moving.
There's a few questions before you go on, and looks like you might be addressing one of them in this picture, but I think you kind of addressed this, but just to clarify, the question was, can I use chicken poop? So I think that was a conversation, yes. And then I have blueberry bushes that are trying their best to stay alive in my clay soil. Can I use the potash to increase the acidity?
Yeah, so blueberries also like sandy soil. So I think this is one thing that, and I really appreciate that question. Some plants are kind of generalist and can grow relatively well in all kinds of soil. And some plants are really kind of niche or specialist plants and prefer like a really manicured and specific environment. So blueberries, you know, I've heard of folks laying down pine needles, kind of buying sand and incorporating potash or sulfur to get acid levels down. So a lot of times, you know, hopeful gardeners will put blueberries in our clayey and relatively alkaline soils, and they don't do very well. And it's because they need a lot of, the soil around blueberries needs a lot of maintenance to move it constantly towards optimal conditions for the blueberry, especially when they're in the ground, because usually they're surrounded by, even if you create those optimal conditions right at the base of the plant, all the surrounding soil is often something different. So that soil is constantly kind of mixing and moving into the area around the roots for blueberries. So if I was to grow them, I would probably do blueberries in a large kind of planter, or put a ton of energy into like preparing maybe a raised bed size area for the conditions that blueberries really want. As it pertains to chicken poo is great. There's specific ways to incorporate manure into soils. And the primary concern with that is you usually don't want manure to touch or make contact with any part of the plant that you would eat, as it could potentially contaminate the consumer of the plant. But you also want to incorporate manure in a way where it is not going to be easily accessed by other people to touch, and also not harmful to other things in the soil. So the appropriate quantity of manure is also something to be mindful of, and how it's being mixed and incorporated into the soil is really important. Some people will mix manures with straw or any kind of brown dried out leafy material, or simply incorporate it into a hot compost or something like that. But you really want to make sure that any bad or negative harmful bacteria are kind of stabilized or neutralized in that before adding it directly to your garden. Okay, I think that's caught up on the chat. How are we doing for time, Keto?
We are good. We're at almost 7:30.
Okay, sweet. Let's see here. So this is kind of a summary. We can increase nutrients through enhancing the soil food web. First and foremost, make sure that you are putting tons of life into the soil. Fertilizing with compost. Compost can include manure and other beneficial arthropods and insects. And we'll get into this next, is consistently covering the ground with cover crops and plants, and then minimizing soil disturbance and the use of chemicals that could be harmful to the soil food web. So that's usually pesticides and herbicides. Okay. So ways to keep soil covered. Healthy soil has tons of moisture in it. Well, maybe not tons of moisture, but it's always moist. It's never like super dry. It has minimal exposure to light and wind, which minimizes erosion and drying out. Healthy soil almost always has plants growing on it. And those plants, of course, have roots that are constantly putting good vitamins, compounds, sugars into the soil and feeding the soil food web. Those healthy plants can include vegetables or cover crops. And then there's other organisms in that soil as well. Mites, worms, spiders, things people might want to name and not name. And then some of my favorites are ants, worms, bacteria, nematodes, and fungi. So I just want to go through some cover crops. Anyone name? How much time do we have, Keto? I'm sorry.
30 minutes.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Can anyone name any of the cover crops in this diagram in the chat? If you recognize them. White clover. No white clover, but I think it's probably thinking this one up here, top right. Daikon radish, buckwheat, yep. Sweet peas, sweet. So really quickly, this top left is hairy vetch, field pea, this is wheat. This is forage radish, also called tillage radish, which is essentially a daikon radish that is bred for its ability to form a large root and not bred for palatability or flavor. So it's specifically growing into the ground to loosen up the soil. This is buckwheat here, and then the bottom is crimson clover. So cover crops are plants grown not directly for or intentionally for consumption. Plants grown to cover the soil, add nutrients to the soil, or be beneficial to soil organisms or pollinators. And these cover crops, and there's a huge list of cover crops. It's actually a lovely resource, cover crops of the Midwest. Ugh. Super huge book, available from the USDA or NRCS. And I think there's probably online versions as well. Cover crops are good for incorporating into plant rows. So if you already have vegetables, you can utilize cover crops to keep moisture in the soil, keep unwanted weeds from growing in, adding nitrogen to the soil or potential companion planting. Cover crops can be grown before cultivating land. So at the MSU site, the year that we did all of our tilling, we planted cover crops. And then the following year, we simply mowed the cover crops and planted our transplants for vegetables into that. And you can also follow a harvest with cover crops. So if you don't plan to do any more planting after maybe you harvest in September or October, you could do cover crops, let those grow through the winter and into the spring, and then terminate those cover crops through tilling or mowing or tarping, and then plant your vegetables for the following season in that.
Quick question. Could you share that title of that book again?
Yes, Cover Crops Field Guide or Midwest Cover Crops. Okay. So, depending on the size of the space that you're managing, cover crops don't always make sense. And if you're, I would say the smaller the space, the less likely or practical it is to use cover crops, because it could just be making additional work for yourself, especially if you can replenish nutrients simply by adding a bit of compost or a small batch of whatever you may purchase. So if you simply want to cover soil without using plants, these are 4 methods pictured here. Top left is a paper mulch, a mulch that will actually decompose over the course of a growing season. We use that at our site on both okra. We grow black-eyed peas and okra in a paper mulch, as well as tomatoes and basil, mostly transplants. It is possible to grow seeds if you cut out spaces in a paper mulch. I prefer not to do that because sometimes the paper can move or something or smother seeds. But if you simply plant transplant into it, you can cut out the space where the transplant will grow and simply put it directly into the soil beneath. There's also plastic mulches, which are valuable and have their place, but plastic is derived from petrochemicals. There is already, as many of us know, plastic in our water and other foods we eat. And some people are fed up and tired of plastic, but it does a great job at killing and smothering other weeds. We grew plastic just for demonstration purposes, strawberries in a plastic mulch, as well as strawberries in a paper mulch. And I would say they performed almost the same. The biggest difference between plastic and paper is the paper mulch is permeable to water and air, which is valuable. And plastic will literally just smother and suffocate everything underneath it. And if it's raining or not raining, the only way to get moisture under plastic mulch is to pour it through the holes that you make in it. On the bottom, there's wood chips on top of cardboard, similar to lasagna gardening, except you would simply be using that probably for walkways or just suppressing weeds in a certain area. And then straw, not hay, which often has weed seeds in it. Straw, which is a lower cutting of a grass without seeds generally. You can load straw on really heavy to suppress weeds and hold in moisture. These things also create habitat for both beneficial and harmful critters. So I've seen potato bugs, squash bugs, slugs, and different things live in certain kinds of mulches and under mulches. So depending on what plants you're growing in it, you may also want to avoid using a mulch. And then on the left side are just some details that I mentioned already about how plastic is not permeable. The paper breaks down, and certain things can live and make shelter in the mulches that we put down. But mulches are super useful because they keep moisture in the soil. So after all the rains that we've had, if you have a good mulch on that soil, you could possibly go a week or longer, depending on how hot and dry it is after rain, without having to do any watering on your own. Whereas if soil is bare, it essentially evaporates and sweats out a lot of that water much faster.
Naim?
Yes.
I don't know what's going on. Your mic is kind of, it seems like
In and out.
periodically your mic goes really low. So I don't know if that just means being slightly closer to your computer, but
Okay.
And then I did also want to mention that we, while you're on talking about mulches, we've been using the woven plastic mulch, basically landscape fabric, with pretty good success. And so it's kind of a hybrid of the paper and the plastic in this situation because it still allows the water to penetrate through, and it works really well.
Do you guys
And
roll that up?
And we're using it at the farm, and it lasts, 6 to 10 years apparently.
Are you actually lifting it up at the end of the season, or you leave it in place?
Well, with the strawberries that we grew, we left it. So I think it just depends on because we're burning holes based on spacing. So we'll probably rotate it around the farm based on the spacing of the crop that we're planting.
Okay. Yes. So there's a mesh kind of like potato bag, burlap bag, plastic that Keto's talking about that also fits into this mulch narrative. Okay, I think this is my last slide. Got some bonus things to talk about with soil. There's biochar, which I consider like a new frontier or a red herring. We're not really clear on how applicable and practical biochar is for certain crops and certain soils. But it's something that a lot of people have become interested in and is growing in its popularity. Biochar is essentially a charcoal-like substance made from organic material burned in a controlled way that gives you that gritty black texture. And the photo on the right is simply showing some of the benefits of it. So it can help retain water in the soil better. It's a very porous material. So it increases moisture retention. It improves nutrient retention. So similar to the particles and the pH of soil, holding those nutrients in place and making them available for plant roots is another thing that biochar does. It's a porous material, so it also creates microhabitat for beneficial fungi and bacteria, which can live on the surface of the char, and it improves soil tilth. So if you have really clayey soil, really hard soil, and you integrate biochar into it, you get a much more ideal soil texture than you would if you just had clay. So those are some of the things we're looking into. We're growing about 50% of everything we grow this year at our site in biochar. So if folks want to come by and see the difference, if there is a difference, we'd be happy to show that and hopefully do some literature and promotion of the value of it at our site. Having a crop plan is a really valuable thing. And a crop plan is simply another way of making sure that your soil is covered the majority of the season. So knowing how much you're going to plant, when you're going to plant, and making sure you're following plantings with plants so that you're consistently growing stuff in the soil, putting life into the soil, and keeping soil food web organisms nourished through plant roots. Being mindful of lead, arsenic, and petrochemicals. I think the short answer is depending on how contaminated the site is, you would either want to A, avoid growing anything there, B, try raised beds or lasagna gardening and just building soil on top of contaminated soil, or C, the long haul of bioremediation and trying to remove metals and things from soil. But the question with that is, once you remove it, where do you send it? It could go to a landfill potentially, but it's got to go somewhere. So some people create berms around the edges of gardens with contaminated soil as well. That is an option. And that's just a diagram that I just posted of a crop plan. So knowing what months you'll be growing which foods or which crops, and then making sure that the soil is never exposed for more than, I would say, 2 weeks if it's possible to avoid that much time, because everything living in the soil that would depend on plant roots would essentially be starving or leaving that area in order to find new habitat and new food. Okay, that's all my slides. Happy to take some questions And I also wanted to post a link to the survey so I can let MSU know that I tried to teach some people some stuff today. I'm putting the survey in the chat.
Could you say
It's
the last
totally optional.
say the last 3 sentences? You went low again.
So finished with my questions. I just wanted to post a survey, an optional survey that I use for reporting to Michigan State about the programming that I offer. Fortunately, Keep Growing Detroit created a platform for me to speak to you guys today. And yes, I'm happy to take questions, and feel free to click the link that I put in the chat if you can fill out the survey. So thank you guys. And I can take the first question in the chat, Keto, if you would.
Yeah. Well, one was I think Judy is interested in do you have a website address for?
Yes. Let me post those things as well.
And then Ashaki was asking, what do you guys plant for winter? I usually just cover my beds for winter.
So we plant, there's actually cold season cover crop mixes. And a lot of times people use the term cover crop, but any plant can also serve as a cover crop. So there are plants like kale, collards, broccoli that actually can grow through the winter and could be used if you just leave the plants in the ground and harvest all the leaves off of them if you want to, but let the roots stay in the soil. The forage radish that I mentioned can grow through the winter. Hairy vetch can grow through the winter. There's winter pea. And I would say you could Google kind of cold season or winter cover crops as well. A lot of companies sell winter cover crop seed mixes, which are actually, plants that can grow in potentially 40-degree weather. As long as there's sunlight and temperatures above freezing, those plants will grow certain grasses through winter wheat as well. So if you have a lot of space that you're managing and you want to get a crop on the ground, those would be good candidates. And I will post our website.
I would just say that if you're growing in small areas like raised beds in particular, just be mindful of what you are planting, because some things may be more than you want. Like they're going to be more of a problem than you want necessarily. Something that winter kills is really good. Like buckwheat, for instance, is a good one. Something that's short season. And one other thing to consider is that, if things can be actively growing, you might be also wanting to grow vegetables at the same time. So if you have limited space to grow in, it's just like it's a trade-off of are you growing vegetables at that time, or are you growing cover crops at that time in some circumstances? Any other questions? At this point, feel free to come off of mute if you'd like. Okay. Well, you've answered all the questions, Naim.
I'd be happy to show the video if folks want to stick around for the site as well. It's 10 minutes long.
Okay. I'm gonna stop the recording at this point then, if that's all right. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And